James Carter was a man who valued his privacy. Living alone in a quiet neighborhood in Maplewood, Missouri, he enjoyed his simple routine, working from home, tending to his garden, and keeping to himself. While his neighbors exchanged friendly waves and small talk, James preferred solitude. It wasn't that he was unfriendly, just that he had learned over the years that keeping a low profile was often the best way to avoid unnecessary trouble. But trouble, as it turned out, had a way of finding him. One Thursday afternoon, after finishing a long morning of work, James decided to check his internet speed. Lately, his Wi-Fi had been unusually slow, video calls lagging, music buffering, and pages loading at a frustrating crawl. Assuming it was just a service issue, he logged into his router settings to take a closer look. That's when he noticed something strange. A device he didn't recognize was connected to his network. The name wasn't a random jumble of letters and numbers. It was labeled Maplewood X1. That didn't belong to him. Someone was using his internet without permission. Annoyed, James reset his password. But as he stood outside for better reception, he had no idea someone was watching and misinterpreting everything. As James stood outside, phone in hand, fingers tapping quickly to reset his Wi-Fi password, he didn't notice the eyes watching him from across the street. Margaret Dawson, a longtime resident in the neighborhood, had always been suspicious of James. It wasn't that he had done anything wrong. He simply didn't engage the way others did. He never attended block parties, never joined the neighborhood watch, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. To Margaret, that was reason enough to keep an eye on him. So when she glanced out her kitchen window and saw James standing in his driveway, staring intensely at his phone, she immediately assumed the worst. His fingers moved rapidly across the screen, his expression serious. To her, it didn't look like he was just using his phone. It looked like he was up to something. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was he hacking into something, stealing information, setting up some kind of scam? The way he stood there, unmoving, focused, made her uneasy. Without hesitation, she reached for her phone and dialed 911. "Yes, I'd like to report something suspicious," she told the dispatcher. "There's a man outside messing with something on his phone. I don't know what he's doing, but it doesn't seem right." The dispatcher asked for more details, but Margaret didn't have any concrete answers. "I just know something's off," she insisted. "Can you send someone to check it out?" Within minutes, the sound of sirens echoed through the neighborhood. James, still focused on his phone, barely registered the noise at first. It wasn't until he saw a police car slowing down, then stopping directly in front of his house, that he realized something was wrong. Two officers stepped out. One was Detective Marcus Navarro, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a sharp gaze that missed nothing. Beside him was Officer Lisa Carter, smaller in frame but carrying an air of quiet authority. James let out a slow breath. Here we go. He didn't move as the officers approached, their expressions unreadable. "Sir," Navarro called out, his voice steady but firm. "We received a call about suspicious activity in the area. Can you tell us what you're doing?" James frowned, confusion evident on his face. Suspicious activity? He glanced between the officers. "I'm changing my Wi-Fi password." His tone was calm, but he could feel frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, standing in his own driveway, being questioned like a criminal. Navarro and Carter exchanged a quick glance before Navarro asked, "Do you live here?" James almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. His car was in the driveway. His name was on the mailbox. Yeah, he said, crossing his arms. I've lived here for 3 years. Before the officers could respond, a voice rang out from across the street. He's lying. James turned, and there she was. Margaret Dawson, standing on her porch, arms folded, her gaze locked onto him like she had just uncovered a dangerous secret. James couldn't believe what he was hearing. Margaret stood there, her face full of conviction, as if she had just exposed some great conspiracy. He's always outside doing something weird, she continued, messing with his phone, looking around like he's watching people. And now he's been standing there for 10 minutes, just tapping away. James exhaled sharply. I was in my router settings, he said flatly, because someone I don't know has been using my Wi-Fi. Margaret scoffed. Oh, sure, and I'm supposed to believe that? Navarro turned to her, his patience thinning. Ma'am, do you have any actual evidence that Mr. Carter has done something illegal? Margaret hesitated. Of course she didn't. She just had a bad feeling. I don't know, she admitted. I just think you should check. Navarro sighed and turned back to James. Sir, would you mind if we take a quick look at your router settings? Just to clear this up. James clenched his jaw. He knew he shouldn't have to prove anything. This was his house and he had done nothing wrong. But he also knew how these situations could spiral out of control if he refused. Fine, he muttered. He unlocked his phone and pulled up the settings. Here, take a look. Navarro leaned in, scanning the list of connected devices. And then his expression changed, because there it was, Maplewood X1. Navarro straightened up. Who owns that device? James shook his head. Not me. Officer Carter's eyebrows knitted together. So someone's been using your Wi-Fi without permission? James nodded. And I don't think they were just stealing internet. Look at the connection logs. It's been running non-stop. Navarro's posture shifted. This wasn't just a petty neighbor dispute anymore. From her porch, Margaret suddenly looked uncomfortable. Wait, what do you mean running non-stop? James turned to her, his eyes cold. I mean, someone has been spying, and they might be watching all of us. A heavy silence fell over the street. Margaret, who had been so sure she was in the right, suddenly looked uneasy. Spying? That wasn't what she expected to hear. Navarro's voice turned serious. Let's go inside. I want to see exactly what we're dealing with. James didn't argue. He led the officers into his house, his frustration simmering just below the surface. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a suspect in his own home. Margaret hesitated before following. She wasn't sure why, but something in her gut told her she needed to hear this. Inside, James placed his phone on the dining table and mirrored the router settings onto his laptop screen. The device list appeared again. There it was, Maplewood X1, still connected, still active. Officer Carter leaned in. Can you see what kind of device this is? James clicked around, his fingers moving fast. I can't tell exactly, but... He opened the activity logs. Then, suddenly, he froze. Navarro noticed the shift in his expression. What is it? James's throat went dry. It's been accessing camera feeds. The room went dead silent. Margaret blinked. I don't understand. What camera feeds? James turned his laptop around. His voice was tight. Mine. On the screen, a list of security camera feeds appeared. James's own home security cameras, his front door, his backyard, his living room, were all there. Someone had been logging in and watching his live feeds. Officer Carter's expression darkened. You're saying someone has been spying on you through your own security system? James exhaled sharply. That's exactly what I'm saying. But then, his stomach dropped, because as he scrolled further, he realized it wasn't just his cameras. His system had flagged multiple IP addresses. Some belonged to his network, but others belonged to different homes. James's voice dropped to a whisper. Oh, this is bad. Navarro leaned closer. What do you mean? James tapped the screen. Whoever this is, they're not just watching me. They're watching other people in the neighborhood. Margaret took a step back, shaking her head. No, that can't be right. James turned to her. You sure about that? He clicked another log. A new feed opened. A dimly lit hallway appeared. Then a living room. Then a bedroom. Margaret gasped. Wait, that's... James didn't even have to ask. He recognized it immediately. It was her house. Margaret stumbled backward, pressing a hand to her mouth. Navarro's voice was sharp. How the hell is this happening? James gritted his teeth. If I had to guess, someone in the neighborhood set up a fake Wi-Fi network. A signal that looks like a normal connection. People unknowingly connect to it, and once they do, their devices get compromised. Officer Carter's face darkened. You mean, a man-in-the-middle attack? James nodded. Exactly. Margaret's voice shook. So you're saying someone's been... What? Watching me? My family? James's eyes didn't leave hers. That's exactly what I'm saying. She sank into a chair, her hands trembling. Oh my God. Navarro's jaw tightened. All right, we need to figure out who's behind this, and fast. But none of them knew. The person responsible was a lot closer than they thought. Detective Navarro wasted no time. He pulled out his radio and called in for cybercrime support. This is bigger than we thought, he muttered to Officer Carter. If someone's running a surveillance network, they're not just invading privacy, they're committing a felony. Carter nodded, her expression grim. And if we don't stop them now, who knows how far they've already gone? James, still seated at his laptop, was already digging deeper. He wasn't a hacker, but he knew enough about network security to trace where the data was being sent. He opened the IP logs, then suddenly he froze. Navarro noticed the shift in his face. What? James turned the laptop screen so they could see. The data isn't going to some random server. It's being sent to an address right here in the neighborhood. Margaret's eyes widened. You mean someone close by is behind this? James nodded, his throat dry. It's coming from a house just a few doors down. Navarro's expression darkened. Can you pinpoint exactly which one? James worked fast, cross-referencing connection timestamps with signal strength. Within minutes, he had a match. His stomach dropped. He recognized the address. Margaret did too. No, she whispered, shaking her head. That's... James cut her off, his voice cold. That's Brandon's house. Brandon Foster, Margaret's own nephew, a 22-year-old college student who had moved in with her a few months ago. He was quiet, always on his computer, barely socialized. And now, suddenly, things were making a whole lot of sense. Margaret's face went pale. No, that doesn't make any sense. Brandon isn't, he wouldn't... Officer Carter stepped in. We need to talk to him. Now. Margaret hesitated. She didn't want to believe it. But deep down, something in her gut told her it was true. I'll take you to him, she murmured. James stood. I'm coming too. Navarro gave him a sharp look. You stay here. Let us handle this. James clenched his jaw. He hated sitting back when he was the one who uncovered everything. But he also knew pushing back wouldn't help. Fine, he muttered. But you'd better get the truth out of him. Margaret's hands shook as she led Navarro and Carter down the street to her house. Every step felt heavier than the last. Brandon, the kid she had taken in, the one she helped through school, it couldn't be him. And yet deep down, a voice in her head whispered, "What if it is?" She opened the front door, calling out, "Brandon? Can you come downstairs for a minute?" No answer. Navarro exchanged a look with Carter before stepping inside. "We're going up." Margaret didn't argue. She just wrapped her arms around herself, her breath unsteady. They climbed the stairs, reaching Brandon's bedroom door. It was shut. No sounds inside. Navarro knocked hard. "Brandon, this is the police. We need to talk." Still nothing. Then, the sound of movement. A chair scraping, footsteps. Carter's hand hovered over her gun. "Open the door, now." Slowly, the knob turned. The door creaked open, and there stood Brandon Foster. Brandon Foster stood in the doorway, his face carefully blank. But James, watching from a distance, could see the nervous energy in his posture. His fingers twitched at his sides, his eyes flickering between Navarro, Carter, and his Aunt Margaret. "What's going on?" Brandon asked, his voice tight. Navarro studied him, his expression unreadable. "We have reason to believe you've been accessing private security cameras in the neighborhood." His voice was calm, but the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. "You want to explain that?" Brandon barely flinched, but James saw it. The slightest tensing of his jaw, the tightening of his fingers. "That's crazy," Brandon scoffed. "I don't know what you're talking about." Officer Carter wasn't buying it. "Mind if we check your laptop?" Brandon's face hardened. "You don't have a warrant." Navarro stepped closer, his voice dropping lower. "Brandon, we can get one. But right now, we're giving you a chance to tell us the truth before this gets worse." A long, tense silence. Then, Brandon exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. "Look, He hesitated, then spoke faster. "I wasn't doing anything illegal, okay? Then why is your IP address linked to a network breach involving multiple homes?" Navarro interrupted, his tone sharp. Brandon froze. Margaret's voice broke. "Brandon, please. Tell me you're not involved in this." Brandon's eyes darted to his aunt. For the first time, his mask cracked. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," he muttered. Navarro's patience thinned. "So you admit you hacked into the network?" Brandon hesitated, then finally nodded. Margaret staggered back as if she had been struck. Brandon's words came spilling out. "It started as a joke. I wanted to see if I could get into someone's Wi-Fi, just to mess with them." Navarro's eyes darkened. "You think this is a joke?" Brandon swallowed hard. "I didn't plan for it to go this far, but then I saw the security cameras and—" Officer Carter's gaze sharpened. "And what?" Brandon's voice was barely above a whisper. "I got curious." Carter's expression turned ice cold. "Curious or obsessed?" Brandon didn't answer. Navarro's jaw tightened. "How many people have you watched?" Silence. Then finally Brandon's voice dropped. "I don't know." Margaret let out a sharp breath, her hands trembling. "Oh my God." Brandon turned to her, for the first time real regret crossing his face. "I swear I wasn't hurting anyone." Navarro didn't let him finish. "Brandon Foster, you're under arrest for unauthorized access of a computer network and unlawful surveillance." Brandon went pale. "Wait. No, Carter was already pulling out her cuffs. Margaret turned away, covering her face as tears welled in her eyes. James had been right all along. And the worst part? Margaret had called the cops on him, when the real danger had been inside her house the entire time. Brandon didn't resist. He just stood there, wrists bound in cuffs, staring at the floor as Navarro read him his rights. His face had lost all its bravado. The weight of what he had done was finally sinking in. Margaret stood frozen, watching as the boy she had raised, the one she had welcomed into her home, was led out like a criminal. Her hands trembled at her sides, her breath coming in short gasps. James stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, his face unreadable. He had every right to be angry, to rub it in, to say, "I told you so." But he didn't. Navarro paused as he passed James. He met his gaze and gave a short nod. "You were right. If you hadn't caught this, we might have never known." James didn't answer right away. He just let out a slow breath, looking between Brandon and Margaret. Then finally, he spoke. "You know what's crazy?" His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable weight behind his words. "I was out here minding my business, changing my own Wi-Fi password, and yet somehow, I was the one who got the cops called on me." Margaret flinched. She had no defense, because there was none. She had called the police without proof, without reason, just a feeling. And that feeling had been wrong. I was wrong," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made an assumption, and it was completely unfair." James let her words hang in the air for a moment. Then, shaking his head, he turned toward his house. "I don't need an apology," he said over his shoulder. "Just do better." Margaret swallowed hard, her face pale as James disappeared into his home. Navarro and Carter exchanged a look before leading Brandon toward the patrol car. He climbed in without a word. He had nothing left to say. Margaret stayed behind, standing alone in the middle of the street. Her mind replayed everything. The call to 911. The certainty that James was the one up to no good. The way she had refused to believe the truth until it was staring her in the face. The truth had been right in front of her all along, but she had been too busy looking at the wrong person. And that mistake, it would haunt her for a long, long time. The patrol car drove away, its red and blue lights flashing against the darkening sky. Margaret stood motionless on the sidewalk, her arms wrapped around herself. The weight of her mistake pressed down on her, heavier than she had ever imagined. She had spent so much time watching James, convinced he was the one to be wary of. But the real threat had been inside her own home, her own nephew. Margaret turned slowly, her gaze drifting toward James's house. His porch light had flicked on, casting a warm glow over the front steps. For a moment, she considered knocking on his door, telling him once again how sorry she was. But what good would that do? James didn't need to hear another apology. He had made that clear. What he needed, what she needed, was change. She needed to be better. Margaret exhaled shakily and made her way back inside her own house. The silence felt heavier now. The living room, once a place of comfort, felt foreign. Her home no longer felt safe, not because of some imagined threat, but because she had ignored the real danger for so long. She sat down on the couch and picked up her phone. Instead of opening social media or messaging a friend, she did something she hadn't done in a long time. She started researching bias, prejudice, the psychology of assumptions. She read stories about people who had been wrongly accused, how fear and stereotypes had led to devastating consequences. And with every article, every story, Her own reflection in the screen seemed clearer. She had been a part of the problem, and it had almost cost an innocent man his freedom. Meanwhile, in his own home, James sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen. His network was finally secure. The breach had been identified, the culprit arrested. But that wasn't what lingered in his mind. It was the way Margaret had looked at him, the instant suspicion, the way she had been so sure that he was the one doing something wrong. He had seen that look before, too many times. James took a deep breath and closed his laptop. He wasn't angry, not anymore. He was tired of always having to prove himself, tired of being seen as a threat for simply existing. But for the first time, someone had realized their mistake. Would it change anything? Would Margaret truly learn from this? Only time would tell. But as James turned off his light and headed to bed, he hoped, just hoped, that tomorrow things might be a little different. Maybe Margaret would think twice before making assumptions. Maybe next time she would choose to ask questions before jumping to conclusions. Maybe, just maybe, she would do better. Because sometimes the biggest change starts with a single realization. Margaret thought she was doing the right thing. She saw something she didn't understand, let her biases fill in the gaps, and acted without proof. In the process, she nearly ruined an innocent man's day, perhaps even his life. James had done nothing wrong, yet he was the one being questioned, the one who had to prove himself. And if it weren't for the deeper truth being uncovered, he might have been labeled as the problem simply because someone assumed he was. This story is a reminder that our biases, whether conscious or unconscious, can lead to real harm. When we jump to conclusions based on fear rather than facts, we risk making terrible mistakes. Instead of reacting out of suspicion, take a step back. Observe. Ask questions. Listen. Because the truth might not be what you expect. And the person you suspect, they might just be the wrong one. How often do we assume the worst about people we don't understand? A quiet neighbor, a stranger on the street, someone who doesn't look like they belong. In real life, false accusations and wrongful assumptions happen all the time. People have lost jobs, reputations, even their lives because someone felt something was wrong, without evidence. The next time you catch yourself making a snap judgment, pause. Ask yourself, do I actually know what's happening? Or am I filling in the blanks with my own fears? Choose to seek the truth instead of assuming it. Because when we let go of bias, we open the door to understanding.